All right, aloha everyone. We are really excited to have a good friend of mine and someone who has been hugely influential in our peace building program. Starting as a student many years ago, we lured him away from computer science, I actually believe, was his major. We met actually at an Arbinger workshop when he was working for the student government to going on to go to Otago University to get his master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution. Then Michael came back here and served as one of our very first graduate interns for the center, and stayed with us for several years and actually took over as director of the McKay Center when I went on sabbatical for a year and helped develop some really important work that we did both in mediation as well as Pacific Island Peacebuilding. Then he went back and just recently completed his PhD. So he is now the first graduate from the IPB program to be technically allowed to be called doctor, Dr. Ligaliga. And now he serves as a professor at Otago University in the Pacific Island Studies program, where he both focuses on areas of Pacific Island studies and Pacific Island issues, as well as peace and conflict. And he's graciously agreed to join us today to talk about Pacific Island peace building, the opportunities that are available to our students, both in programs and work, and his research and what he's been working on. And he also offers a great class that he teaches every fall semester. So if you're not in it, you're going to have to wait, unfortunately, until next year. We're a Pacific Island peace building class as well. And on top of all of that, he has this amazing wife, two amazing children that it's been really cool to see and grow up. And he's an incredible father and mentor to so many of our students who have gone on to Otago to work in this field. And so it's just an honor to have Michael, Dr. Ligaliga. I just like calling you Dr. Ligaliga now, with us today. And I'm going to turn the time over to him, and he's going to talk to us about this really important issue for our target area and for our students in our program. Michael?
Thanks, Chad. I'm really thankful for this opportunity to meet with you guys and just share with you some of the things that I've been busy with the last couple of years. Let me just, am I able to share my screen, Chad?
Yes, let me make you a co-host. Okay, sir, you should be able to go.
Thank you. Let me just quickly share my screen. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, peace building in the Pacific is a little bit different in understanding sort of what it is and the type of work that's been involved. And I thought I'd just go through a couple of things that I feel it's really important to kind of preface our discussion. When we talk about peace, from a theoretical perspective, we talk a lot about positive and negative peace, which is something that you're probably really familiar with. But in the Pacific, peace, irrelevant of which Pacific Island nation that you're talking about, it's all about harmony and ensuring that those relational spaces are always maintained. And people think of harmony as 50-50, but it could be an 80-20 split, 60-40, so long as both sides are happy. So we talk about harmony between the created and the creator, the dead and the living, the sea and the sky, and between male and female, and those sort of things. Those are the things that are of greater importance and sort of from a Pacific's perspective. And it's all about relationships, ensuring that whether they're spiritual relationships or whether they're relationships between people or between the environment, such as the land or and those sort of things, That's what's of priority when we are talking about peace in the Pacific. So I just wanted to kind of frame that first. Anytime we talk about peace in the Pacific, it's around these ideologies of harmony. And then, you know, the other thing I started to think about was, okay, so what we always talk about peace building, but in the Pacific, there's so many different other areas of peace that is really important and really relevant in terms of reconciliation processes. And you know, there's peacekeeping, peacemaking, and obviously peace building. And so, for example, in peacekeeping, this is a picture here on the left of where the New Zealand and Australian government had to come into the Solomon Islands and kind of put at ease a civil war that happened between the Solomon Island people, which is a form of peacekeeping. Peacemaking, the New Zealand government had to come in and, you know, in this same conflict, they weren't allowed, they weren't able to negotiate any sort of peace accord or peace treaty because it was too dangerous to have it in the Solomon Islands. You know, the Solomon Islands are very small. So the New Zealand government, they actually brought their naval ship and they had it on a very neutral area. And so they brought them onto the ship where this agreement was signed. So an example of peacemaking in the Pacific. And just in recent times, there's been a huge movement in the Bougainvillean government between these people to move towards more reconciliation processes. So when we talk about peace, and you know, obviously it's a quite loaded term. In the Pacific, a lot of these areas are still currently functioning in terms of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. And the reason why it's really important to understand this is that when we're looking at conflict in general, it really, you know, we need to tailor make our peace approaches according to which area, you know, which point of the conflict that it is in. Sometimes when it's really high in warfare and those sort of things, peacekeeping is probably the best thing to do. When there's resolutions that are slowly when there's desires to have some sort of reconciliation process and formalizing, then we look at peacekeeping, and then peace building as we go towards sort of, you know, when post-conflict. So it's really important to keep in mind that those different phases, and some of you guys might be really, really good at that, you know, peacekeeping area. Some of you guys might be really good at peacemaking in terms of policy, in terms of negotiation, you know, those sort of things. And some of you guys might be really good at the grassroots levels and ensuring that more long-term reconciliation processes are put into place. We tend to think of the Pacific as this utopian where there is no problems, where we are all peaceful, we hug each other, we do things together, there's no animosity or those sort of things. And I guess to some extent there is sort of that kind of utopian perspective, but I think a lot of the times, you know, the crystal clear waters and the palm trees and the blue skies kind of camouflage a lot of the issues that have happened in the past. So for example, right now there's still issues in West Papua. We've had assassinations of political leaders. This is the Bougainvillean War. On the top right-hand corner, you probably think this is a scene out of somewhere in, you know, in the Middle East or somewhere like that, in Syria or something like that. But that's the Kingdom of Tonga. That's when they had the riots in 2006 and Tonga literally burnt down. We've had coups, political coups, and so forth. We've had riots and those sort of things. So the Pacific has not been, you know, no one's immune to conflict. Everyone experiences in the Pacific, especially. And I just want to go through sort of like the common, some of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. There's not too many warfares in terms of those militarization, military conflicts and those sort of things. The Pacific has experienced a whole new sort of vast array of different kind of conflicts, and they kind of band around these social issues that we're experiencing right now. The first one is climate change. This is the biggest conflict right now in the Pacific. Why? There's so many other ramifications that are filtered out of this problem. You know, for example, it is understood that if current trends continue, then low-lying islands such as Tuvalu and Tokelau, especially in the Kiribati, within 60 to 80 years, they'll be underwater. And these are some of the signs that they've put up to kind of show sort of how drastic this issue is. Why is it sort of a conflict? Well, there's no legislations right now around helping climate change refugees in the Pacific. What happens when, they lose their identity, their land, it goes underwater? Where do they go to? What sort of cultures do they adopt? What are those kind of ramifications? When they go, they're approaching countries like Fiji, New Zealand, Australia to adopt these people to come across. And currently they haven't really thought about those things in terms of from a legal perspective, but even from a social perspective about cultural identity and those sort of things. So climate change is a huge issue right now, and we're still trying to wrap our minds about how this is going to look in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. There's also a heightened increase of social issues in the Pacific that's part of a huge push towards sort of conflict and resolution and conflict management ways to help these issues. Domestic violence is big in the Pacific. Incest, rape, prostitution, and child abuse are magnified problems in the Pacific. The reason why these are becoming more prominent now is because people are now have the ability to talk. There's more platforms. These are not taboo issues like before. And now we have more and more people trying to understand these issues. And in general terms, the Pacific in general has the highest rates per capita of domestic violence, incest, rape, women and child abuse in the entire world. So these are huge problematic issues. The other big conflict that we're having right now is transnational crimes and managing those spaces in terms of drug trafficking, sex trafficking, arms dealerships, illegal plants and animal smuggling. And this picture highlights the problem. A lot of the drug trafficking routes are now coming through the Pacific because the Pacific cannot monitor these big masses of oceans. And so you see now there's a lot of successful transportations of drugs, illegal drugs, especially smuggling of exotic plants and animals. It's really hard to monitor these because it's not like, countries like Samoa, Fiji, and Tonga have big militaries to kind of police these areas. And the Pacific are home to the largest EEZ zones in the world, like economic exclusive zones. And so they rely on countries like New Zealand, Australia, America, and France, who they have colonial ties to monitor these areas. And so this is becoming a big problematic issue in the Pacific as well. Corruption is also another big problem in the Pacific. How do these people manage so much money, millions and millions and millions of dollars? And this has become a big problematic issue, a huge concern for the United Nations, for the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank. There's a lot of money that's coming through these countries, and a lot of them have been mismanaged. And this is causing a lot of problems as well. Another big, and it's not obvious, it's land issues throughout the entire Pacific. This is probably the hot topic right now around the alienation of land. This is just a recent one here in Aotearoa, a piece of land up in Auckland, Ihumata, where there was a lot of friction between the Crown and local iwi or the local Maori that owns the lands, where a big construction company wanted to develop it, but this is quite a very sacred land to the indigenous Maori. We've seen this with what was happening there in Hawaii with Mauna Kea. It's all over the place. Even in Samoa, they're amending legislations to privatize customary land. So it's a huge issue at the moment. Another big issue that's in terms of conflicts is women, gender rights, children's rights. This is a huge issue in the Pacific because a lot of the communal cultures, there's no such thing as individual rights. And so this is another problematic issue. It's trying to understand that children and women do have rights, and they can be heard in a Western sort of democratic process. But in the village setting, under communal law, many of the children and women do not have rights. So that's another big problem. I just finished giving a lecture. I gave a lecture this morning, and I'll be doing one next week at the Faculty of Law, where I'm having discussions with the 4th and 5th year law students around the difference between communal law and individual law and the friction that's caused between these two. So individual law, so for example, individual law is, if someone offended you, you can take them to court and the court hears you. But if the court says, they're going to take the village and the village is at fault, they fine the village. When the family goes back to the village, as soon as they step into the village, that law that was passed in the court has no place in the communal law, communal environment, because the chief says no. Yeah. And so there's a lot of problematic issues around here, around legislation, around just how people live in the Pacific. And this has been a cause of a lot of conflicts in Pacific in general. So the role of culture in the Pacific. This is some of the things that I'm working on right now. It's, while it's really nice to use culture and, is to say, look, we're going to use our culture to promote peace, there's a lot of problematic issues around this. And I just wanted to kind of discuss this to be cognizant about these things. There's so many Pacific models out there. You have on the left, it's the Whānau Whale model, which talks about the importance of family and spirituality and those sort of things, the importance of culture. On the top, you have a Tuvaluan health model. On the right hand, the circle here, this is the Tapasa model of the compass they use in education. We have a mental health model down here. And then in the middle, we have the Whare Tapawha model. It's a health model, Māori health model. There's so many different models, but the strength of these models is culture. And the weakness of this model is culture as well. And I'll explain to you some of the things that we've been working on with some of the that I've been working on with some of the government agencies. The problem with culture is that you can have all of these beautiful, intricate models that talk about the importance of family and culture and those sort of things. But if you're trying to explain these things to first, second, third generation Pacific Islanders in New Zealand who have no connection to these cultural values, then this model will not serve its purpose. And that's the thing that I've been talking about with a lot of these government agencies who've come to me, like, it's all fun and wild to put up a nice marae, a picture of a marae or Samoan whale or Samoan hut. But if it does not resonate with the people who you're trying, to talk to, then it's just absolutely nothing's gonna happen. And so what I've been doing is challenging the status quo. So we had a government agency reach out to me that they wanted me to take care of of a program down here in Dunedin with young fathers, how to mentor young fathers towards their children. And they basically were going to do a cut and paste model down here in Dunedin. And I said, that's not going to work because the fathers in Auckland are very different to the Pacific Island fathers who are down here in Dunedin. Many of them, of the Pacific Island fathers, they actually come from the Pacific Islands and they have a much more stronger connection to these cultural protocols versus, say, for the fathers who are New Zealand born Pacific Islanders. It's the same thing that we're having with discussions with some of the models they're trying to implement in Utah, which represents, I think Utah has the largest amount of Pacific Islanders in any state or something like that, or close to the largest. And they reached out to me about why some of their Pacific models are not working. And I said, well, it's because you guys are doing a one size fits all. And a lot of these things don't really resonate with, a first or second generation United States born Pacific Islander. So that's where the problem is. One of my favorite quotes that's really driving a lot of my work right now is by this Hawaiian philosopher, Kamehili Hiva. And what she was talking about, this is in terms of sort of their navigation, right? And it talks about, it is as if the Hawaiian stands firmly in the present with his back to the future and his eyes fixed upon the past, seeking historical answers for the present day dilemmas. And so in my current class, some of my students, I think they're chiming in. In my current class, we talk about this, how can you face your back to the future? Like you're actually walking towards the future with your back facing the future. So you're kind of like walking backwards. And a lot of this philosophy is kind of driving my work right now. I'm just looking at seeing who's here. Maybe I'll pick on, no one's here. Okay, I won't pick on anyone. So what do you guys think this saying, this proverb or this philosophy, Hawaiian philosophy means? Any of you guys? You guys want to take a stab at what this means? What do you guys think this might mean? Anyone?
I think of how, like, for us to learn from, like, we came from the people that went before us, and so we are, we can make the same mistakes they did. And if we look to the past to see how they dealt with the few, like, our, how they dealt with situations, that will help us in knowing how to prepare for the future or create a better future.
Awesome, thank you for that. In the Pacific Island culture, and Jackie can probably talk more, about the Maori culture, but I think it's kind of in the same sort of light. We never face our backs towards anyone. It is very disrespectful to face your back towards someone, whether it's your children, whether it's your parents, especially the elderly, right? This Hawaiian proverb puts priority in ensuring that we are continually facing those who have come before us. Yeah, it prioritizes their culture, their cultural understanding, and that everything we do in terms of navigating towards the future is determined by those in our past. That's why we never face our backs to them and never face our backs to the past, right? That informs the way that we go towards the future, which got me thinking with a lot of the peace building models that we have right now, it's actually facing their backs to the past and actually looking forward, which is a very Western approach, right? But we need to kind of revisit a couple of things. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is challenging a lot of the current models that are out there. We always talk about peace building. We need to build, 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 build. But in terms of issues that are happening in the Pacific, and Hawaii is a classic example, we cannot build first. We have to deconstruct first before we build. Now, one of my favorite programs is the HGTV, where they do all those renovations and those sort of things. I love that show. And one of the things that really fascinates me is that when they do the costing, the most expensive part of the build is the deconstruction. When they find out, when they flip homes, when they find out how much damage that's been done, and then they need to invest a lot of money to reinforce the structure and those sort of things. A lot of the times with a lot of the Western models, they just come in and build on top of, it's like just slapping a fresh coat of paint, and it looks nice, but they haven't dealt with the more deeper issues. Yeah. And so one of the things that I've been telling a lot of the government ministries is that we need to deconstruct first. We need to see what the problems are, and then we need to construct based on what the damage has been done. And a lot of the times that journey can be quite difficult because not too many people want to have that discussion of things that have happened in the past or how it's been constructed wrong or weak, the construction's been weak. And so I just want to give you a couple of examples of some of the work that I'm doing right now. Right now, in terms of domestic violence and family violence, and in hearing the models that they're using right here, I'm just going back to the stuff that I learned in IPB 121. When we talked about Kotong's violence triangle, right? When Kotong said everything, the behavior is visible and the structure and cultural violence is invisible. This is perfect in a Western world, but in the Pacific Island, in the Pacific, our structures and our cultural ideologies are not invisible. In fact, we love to parade them. Yeah, we put them out on the forefront. They're not invisible. However, the problem of domestic violence is very visible. It's very invisible. It's because it's usually dealt with in-house. We put a lot of shame on our family if we take them to the police. We don't report them, right? we don't report the, whoever's been involved. So we actually keep the behavior on invisible, but our cultural protocols, our structural institutions within Pacific Island culture is very visible. So I've said to them, look, we need to actually flip our understanding of perception of the approach that you're doing, and kind of think it from upside down. And that's what we're doing right now. We're looking at ways to make the invisible, which is the behavior, visible. Yeah. And so these are some of the things that I'm currently developing right now. In terms of mediation, I am a member of the Resolution Institute, which is one of the governing mediation bodies here in New Zealand. They've came and reached out to me to develop a Pan-Pacific mediation model to be used in disputes, especially in employment and tenancy disputes with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Enterprise. One of the models that I'm using is the AFA model. AFA is the Senate rope that's used widely around the Pacific. The construction of the AFA rope is made of those little individual coconut fibers, and that they are rubbed together to make a bigger fiber. And so one of the things that we're developing actually right now, each strand represents an issue. And so what happens is the first party gets a piece of the string. So for example, this blue string, and then we ask them what are his or her issues. And then the next question is, what are some of the things that are causing problems for this issue? Every time there's a problem, they will tie a knot. Every time they identify another problem with that one issue, they continue to tie a knot and another knot and another knot until they get one rope full of knots. And we do the same thing with the other party. And then in the entanglement stage, then we ask them the question, so how does this particular issue connect with the other person's rope? And then they'll talk about it. Then we tie those two ropes together. Then we have a red and a blue knot tied together, right? And then so forth. And all of a sudden we get a messy entanglement. And then we go through the disentanglement stage. And the mediator is not called the mediator, but the mediator is called the weaver, to help weave new narratives and so forth. And so this is something that I'm developing right now with a team of Pacific mediators. And this is one project that I'm spearheading right now. So in terms of understanding peacebuilding and from a Pacific's perspective, we kind of have to do the reverse of not just kind of build, but we really need to unpack first, deconstruct first, see what needs to be done, then we can reconstruct or build something that's quite new. And that's more specific for the purpose rather than just getting something, the scope is quite big and just, hashing it out and to everyone. So in terms of looking at sort of areas of work in the Pacific, it is widespread. We need people. They're still in need of peacekeeping. There's still need of peacemaking. There's still need of peace building in the Pacific. The United Nations is sort of like the big sister of the Pacific, where they're rolling out a lot of programs. We need, especially in terms of social issues, that's where the Pacific really needs help. But one of the things that I think that I've come to realize, especially working with these government ministries, is that we're still pretty much at square one. They've kind of rolled out the same things over and over again, and now they're quite excited with a different lens, a different perspective in terms of addressing sort of what's happening in the Pacific. Mediation is going to be a huge avenue for reconciliation processes in the Pacific. In fact, there are some countries, especially in Samoa, that by law, you have to do mediation before it goes to the courts. And now even in New Zealand, many of the disputes are coming through mediation before it even goes to the high courts, land tribunals, and so forth. So as a skill in itself, mediation is probably the top one in terms of addressing a lot of the issues here. But I'm more than happy to discuss things further with you. I thought I'd leave some time if there's any questions about sort of things in the Pacific. As you can see, a lot of our problems are not necessarily stemmed out of kind of warfare or all those sort of things. A lot of the things that are impacting the Pacific right now is all of these social issues, such as, you know, transnational crimes, domestic violence, substance abuse, and those sort of things. Those are the type of conflicts that are impacting the Pacific. So, I mean, that's all I kind of prepared. I don't know if there's any questions or if there's anything else that I can help with in terms of anything. But yeah, thank you for your time.
Awesome, Mike. Let's do that. Let's open up to questions, and both on Facebook. If you have those, we'll look at those as well as here. It looks like Bella has a question, Mike. And Bella, do you just want to speak it, or do you want me to read it? Why don't you speak it? Can you take off? I want to get you in trouble.
I'm in the library, so I'm trying to be quiet.
Okay.
But basically my question is there a place for Westerners like myself to work as a mediator in the Pacific? Because I don't want to come in with white saviorism, but I'm interested, and that's something that I'd want to like help with.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And look, you don't have to be a Pacific Islander or hold a Samoan passport or a Tongan passport to come and do work in the Pacific, right? I go back and revisit that Hawaiian proverb, right? So long as you understand the importance of facing your not facing your backs towards the past, and for the lack of words, that's the main thing. We have a lot of wonderful people who are not Pacific Islanders who are doing amazing work in the Pacific, right? And to me, I'm not saying that to disregard those Western models of understanding, you know, those frameworks, because it provides a framework. Because right now there's not too many frameworks that we can use or we can rely on to address a certain issue in terms of mediation or in terms of family violence or domestic violence. We need those frameworks to start, you know, helping us to think about what ways we can do to address our cultural protocols and practices around those types of frameworks, which hopefully eventually we can do something instead of a hybrid model, but a more pure Pacific model, if that makes sense. So we still need that input. We still need that input. So yeah, by all means, yeah, most definitely.
That's a great question, Bella, and appreciate that. And obviously a really great response. Who else might have questions
Yep.
for Mike?
So everything you kind of shared, is that kind of like what you specialize in your master's program and all that stuff? Or like even just at Otago?
With the things that I shared? Yeah, so when you come to Otago, a lot of the issues that they discuss is around the region. So in terms of sort of what's happening in New Zealand and just around, especially sort of New Zealand's role in the peace building and their peace building sort of capacities throughout the region. New Zealand and Australia are viewed as the metropolitan powers of the Pacific, but New Zealand in particular are more viewed as Pacific versus Australia. They're more sort of more Pacific in tune with the Pacific than Australia for some reason. They've always been viewed like that. So New Zealand, in terms of peace building, in terms of their role in the Pacific, are much more, so they have much more weight than Australia, even though Australia pours a lot of money and much more money than New Zealand. But a lot of this work here that I'm doing right now kind of stemmed out of curiosity and the things that I learned at the at the IPP program, as well as here. One of my fondest memories and is Chad. Remember we used to go out to Hakipu
Yep. Hakipu'u. Yeah.
We met with the local leaders, local kupunas there, and one of my fondest memories was just sitting down with the local kupunas and just talk story with them. And a lot of the things that he spoke of really informed what I'm doing right now. And you will find that a lot of the models that exist in New Zealand, Australia, and throughout the world, in terms of Māori and Pacific, it's the same models for the last 20, 30 years. The other thing that I keep reminding people here in New Zealand is that it's not just in New Zealand that we have a large Māori and Pacific population, right? In the United States as well, there's so many of our people that they need help. And a lot of those people have reached out to me for help in terms of rethinking those models, if that makes sense. We've found that a lot of these culturally specific models, many of our young Pacific Islanders don't really have a connection to it. You know, they talk about the importance of spirituality, but there's a lot of our young Pacific Islanders and Māori who are quite secular, and religion is not a big part of their lives. They don't see the importance of it. So if a Pacific or Māori model comes in and say, look, spirituality, which is a lot of the models do, if the people who that are listening to the model have no connection to it, then it's a waste of time. They have a huge disconnect. And that's what they're looking at right now. How can we reappropriate a lot of those models to help our people? And that's the kind of work that I'm doing right now.
Oh, cool. I think that's something I'd like to get into later on. Yeah. Thanks.
And we really need our people to, you know, and I'm talking specific to our Pacific Island and Māoris. Like, my PhD was on looking at the issues of domestic violence. And I pointed the finger at the Samoan culture, religion, the chief system as the contributing factors towards that issue. Now, anytime I presented, I got chastised. I got slayed by my own people. They told me that I was very un-Samoan. I was disrespectful to the culture. But the reality is they needed to hear it because that's what's causing the problem. And I'd rather them hear it from me as a Samoan or from you as Māori, you know, than from anyone else. And so there's that sense of ownership for us as you know, future, you know, those who are going through school, to use that opportunity, that platform to change up the discussion. Yeah.
Mike, can you talk about there's another question, but in general, if this is an area that our students want to pursue beyond their undergraduate degree, what sort of graduate programs exist out there for Pacific Island Peacebuilding? I mean, obviously talk about Otago, but are there other programs as well? What sort of scholarships are available? And then Bella has a related question, which is how do people pay for graduate school? I think you're a great example of that, because I know that financially things were very, very, very tight for you and your family. And so, you know, how do you make that happen?
I think Chad touched on this. In terms of grad school, you need to go where your field of interest is location is, and you know, is one thing. But so for example, I always had high hopes to go to somewhere like George Mason or to Notre Dame or those sort of things. But I always wanted to do something around Samoa, right? And so even though on paper it would be nice to have a degree from George Mason or Notre Dame, I knew that I had to come within my region because that's where all the experts were. Now, there's not too many sort of peace and conflict schools that actually focuses on the Pacific outside of the National Center of Peace and Conflict Studies. But the other route that you can go is to attend universities within the region that have Pacific Island and Māori studies programs and Indigenous studies programs, where you can actually use that space as a platform to discuss whatever issue that you have from an Indigenous lens, if that makes sense. So, for example, we have some of the masters and PhD students that I'm supervising right now. We have some of them are from geography, some of them are from religion, all these different perspectives, but they wanted a really strong indigenous perspective. So they decided to come and do their PhD out at Te Tumu School of Māori, Pacific and Indigenous Studies, right? So you don't necessarily have to go to, a conflict resolution school if it doesn't specializes in Indigenous studies. One of the things you can do, and many of the schools here in New Zealand, some of them in Australia, but more so in New Zealand, they have a really strong Indigenous program in terms of postgraduate studies. And that's what we're seeing right now. I have students from America who's doing Indigenous studies program because they want to work in amongst the American Indians and so forth. And so they've done a master's in Indigenous studies through our center around those issues. So yeah, but in terms of scholarships, yeah, this is how I did it. I applied for anything, whether it was $100, whether it was $50, whether it was $50,000, I applied. Because when you get to this level of education, any money helps. But I know this for a fact. Right now, in 2020, if you have good grades, there should not be an excuse for you not to get a scholarship. It might not be a university scholarship, but there's so much funding out there. You just have to look. And so what I did in my last 6 months of school, every night, and I'm not lying, every night for 2 to 3 hours, I'll be on Google. I'll be writing down the scholarships. What do I need? What do these scholarships need? How much? And I just started applying. I just threw in any sort of application to get in. So don't be disappointed if you don't qualify for a university scholarship. So for me, my first year of PhD studies, I didn't get a scholarship. My second year, I applied for a government scholarship with the Internal Affairs. Part of that requirement, I had to do a report for them, and that's fine. At least I got a year's for free. And then my last year, the university offered me a PhD scholarship. So I was very blessed in my last year of studies. But if there's, if you're looking at Indigenous studies in general, or Pacific studies, or Indigenous studies, or peace and conflict scholarships, and those sort of things, just send me an email, and we can do this together. I've got a pretty good way of navigating those things. So just let me know.
I can also add one thing, and I might be jumping the gun a little bit. I may have more information than a lot of people do right now. A little bit hesitant that, but I've been working with some people on some projects with Dangerous Love, and one foundation that I've worked with, and I won't out them completely, are about ready to make a very major contribution to Oceania to sort of reverse the legacy of colonialism and imperialism that is going to include major grants for education, for graduate school, conflict resolution, what have you, for Indigenous applicants from the area. And that hoping in that 2021, those are going to start to materialize in some really big ways. And so I've been in discussions with them. They reached out both about the book, but also because I'm working here in the Pacific, and I just think there's going to be some great opportunities again for our Pacific Islander students in particular to find grants, both scholarships as well as grants for projects in the Pacific that haven't existed previously. And so it's an exciting time to work there and be there as more people are starting to recognize the importance of Oceania. I mean, I just was blown away that that's where the focus was going to be, because you don't hear that every day, right? From major nonprofits, that's where the focus is going to be. And I just think it's awesome. And so, Chesser, Jackie, some of you, this could be some great opportunities coming in the near future. Other questions for Michael? Let me check Facebook. Oh, Michael, got a question on Facebook. This is from Lucy.
Lucy.
Lucy's one of our graduates, originally from Tasmania, who I think just completed, right? She just completed her master's at Otago University. We love Lucy. She asks, would you say that traditional Pacific Island practices of mediation should be monitored to ensure transparency with a Western democratic lens?
Should be monitored.
To ensure transparency.
Right now, there's no Pacific mediation model. That's why they've come and asked me to develop it. One of the biggest issues is around transparency, but the biggest issue, another issue is about, so in Samoa, the way they do mediation is everyone comes into a really big room. And so you have the offender and the offended, you have both their families, you both have their chiefs, and then you also have the religious minister, whoever they might be. And so when you do the mediation, it's large group mediation, but the offender and the offended gets lost in the discussion because there's still that communal authority, because they don't talk to the offender and the offended. It's the high chiefs that are having the discussions, right? And so if the high chief says, yeah, we're good, everything's fine, everyone leaves, but the two parties that were involved in the issue, their issues are never resolved. And so it's about unpacking those things. Because one of the things that the last time I was in Samoa, and when they asked me to kind of, what's the word? To assess the mediation, I said that was the biggest problem. You need to get rid of all of these people. They need to leave the room. That's your biggest problem. The mediation room should be smaller. And all of the hats, whatever hats they wear of high chief and those sort of things, that needs to come out of the room, because even the mediator could be a high chief, could be a member held in high esteem in his church. And so it's really, really hard to kind of dissect those worlds, keep those worlds separate. And that's been very influential and it's kind of informed a lot of the decision-making processes. We had an issue here with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Enterprise, where the local iwi had issues as well. And the media didn't know whether to go and have it on the marae or outside of the marae, right? And so one of the things that the recommendations that I made was, and this is going back to that Hawaiian proverb of never turning your back to your past. I said, let's go and fulfill the cultural protocols in the marae. Let's get that out. Let's set the tone. Let's set the cultural and the spiritual tone, because that's really going to inform the discussions. Once that's done, then we can hold the discussions outside of the marae. I think that's all they wanted. I think that's all the iwi wanted, to be acknowledged from that perspective. And that's what happened. They went in, they held their meeting in the marae. Cultural protocols were satisfied, but then they left and then they had the two parties together. So for Lucy, yes, it's still a bit of an oil and water don't mix situation. But again, this is a very new space. When I mean new, I mean it's really new. Trying to unpack mediation processes from a Māori perspective and also from a Pacific perspective, because we tend to get bottled up. Even though we're Polynesians, we're completely different in terms of how we do things. And that's been the biggest problem, more particularly here in New Zealand. And those are the kind of things that I'm doing right now. And we need more help.
Michael, I don't have a question. I just a combination of acknowledgement and a question. First of all, just to acknowledge the hard work that you're doing, you and your team, and what you're breaking new ground in Aotearoa. And for Māori, I understand, that our past is our future, and our future is our past. And part of that is enabling our rangatahi and the new generations to be able to connect and have those connections. I can see there's a big shift with restorative justice in terms of cultural practices and ensuring conflict is not engaged during the conferences by bringing external stakeholders in to those conversations, bringing it back to the core people that were involved.
Yeah.
Do you see that similarly moving in the same direction with mediation now, bringing it back in to the core parties so the cultural dynamics don't super.
Did she just did Jackie just?
Yeah, I think we lost her.
Yeah. So
maybe you can.
You
add
know what, Jack?
Mike.
Yeah. So what Jackie was saying is like that's part of that deconstruction process, right? Because we just all these new sort of approaches, Pacific approaches, indigenous approaches. To me, it's just like people coming with a bucket of paint and just painting over whatever they had last year, and saying this is a new model. But that's not what we're doing. And kind of what Jackie was saying, a lot of us are saying we need to go back, deconstruct all of those things, see what the damage has been done. And one of the biggest things is those colonial attitudes that kind of Chad was talking about, and discussing those kind of things. And those are kind of hard discussions. It can actually stir a lot of conflict. I've been in situations where just the mention of the word, it can be quite, can put people in the box straight away. But in terms of revisiting those things, most definitely. I'm just commenting on your question, Jackie, that yes, that's the approach, getting people who's supposed to be there to be in that mediation process. Yeah, and that's all part of like their whole deconstruction mission that I'm trying to tell people that, stop painting the process. We need to strip those things down. And, like, people don't want to do that work because it's work, but it's important work. And that's what we're seeing right now in Aotearoa, especially here in New Zealand. And so there's been a lot of interest in a lot of the work that I'm doing in Australia, in the United States, especially with our Pacific community in Utah. They've kind of reached out for guidance along those things. So it's not just here. There's so much work to be done. I'm just grateful to be at this sort of crossroad where I can use a lot of the stuff that I've learned there in the IPP program, and the things that I'm doing now is because of those classes. I kid you not, and especially those times where we used to go to Haki Pool. Those were probably my fondest memories of sitting down with those people and just listening to their stories. And that really formed my mindset of some of the work that I need to do. It actually really informed me to pursue a PhD. I know a PhD is not for everyone, but with the work that I really wanted to do, I just felt in my heart that I needed to pursue a PhD. For some of you, that might not be the case. You don't need to, if you don't need a PhD, by all means, don't put yourself through the agony of going through a PhD, right? To do the work. But if you really feel that it's something that you need to make change, whether it's in peacekeeping, peacemaking, or peace building, then by all means do it. I'll fully support you. I'm here as a resource. But we just need more help. We need more help.
Final question, Mike. Very important one. How does your peace building and indigenous academic and field work mix with your mad disc jockey DJ work?
Oh, man.
Anonymous.
Anonymous, yeah. I think I know who the person is. It's the only thing that keeps me sane. That's what really keeps me. I've been DJing for a long time. And I used to do a lot of DJing here in Dunedin, but since I got called into the state presidency, I said some of those environments are not conducive to a member of the state presidency. So, so you guys go and do it. I'll support you from the background. But yeah, one of the things that I love is music. I'm a huge fan of music, and I think a lot of it does inform the way the work that I do. Main thing is it keeps me happy, keeps me sane. But yeah, thanks, David, for the question.
Yeah, you guessed it. By the way, my bishop in Waialua is also a professional DJ. with some really
Nice.
bad skills. So awesome. That's Dr. Ligaliga, everyone. A great example of one of our alumni who has continuously throughout his life fulfilled President McKay's prophecy that from the school would go men and women who would be influences towards the establishment of peace internationally. And someone who's done it at great sacrifice for all the hard work, through all the financial challenges, family challenges, to make this happen, but it's been a huge blessing back to our program here at BYU Hawaii, and certainly to all of the students and people he's interacting with at Otago. And we're just so grateful to have Mike as a friend and colleague, and grateful that he took the time out with us today. Next week, Chris Pineda, another one of our alumni who has started a nonprofit called Corner Piece in Salem, Oregon, who is doing incredible work with the government, with school teachers throughout the community there in Salem, will be joining us to talk about starting your own nonprofit and what that looks like, and that as an avenue towards engaging in a peace building career. And Chris is another one of our alumni who's just gone on to do great things. He also ended up doing his master's online while he was working full time, and is now actually in a PhD program as well in organizational behavior and peace building. And so we'll get a different perspective on that next week. If you're interested in perhaps starting your own thing and your own nonprofit, Chris will be a great resource. And so we'll see you again next week, everyone. Thanks for coming. Aloha.